Judge Karen Thompson ruled courtroom 3B with an iron fist and a meticulously organized docket. Every pen on her desk sat at precisely a 45-degree angle. Every file was color-coded and alphabetized. Every lawyer knew better than to interrupt her, chew gum, or even breathe too loudly. Her courtroom was not merely a place of law. It was a sanctuary of order, and Karen was its high priestess. Recently, that sanctuary had been particularly blessed. She'd presided over 3 landmark cases in as many months: a complex corporate espionage trial, a high-profile celebrity divorce, and a contentious battle over water rights that pitted farmers against a powerful land developer. In each instance, Karen had delivered decisive rulings, solidifying her reputation as a legal titan. Legal publications sang her praises. Television networks clamored for interviews. Karen, never one to shy away from the spotlight, granted them selectively, carefully crafting an image of intellectual brilliance and unwavering integrity. But beneath the veneer of judicial impartiality lay a growing sense of self-importance. The accolades fueled an ego that was already substantial. She began to see herself not just as a judge, but as a guardian of justice, a bulwark against the encroaching chaos of the outside world. Courtroom 3B became her personal domain, and any perceived slight, any deviation from her rigid standards, was met with swift and uncompromising retribution. Her staff tiptoed around her, anticipating her every need, terrified of incurring her wrath. Lawyers entered her courtroom with trepidation, knowing that a single misstep could result in a stinging rebuke or worse, a contempt of court charge. Even the bailiffs, hardened veterans of countless courtroom dramas, treated her with a deference usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. Karen reveled in this atmosphere of control that validated her sense of purpose, reinforced her belief in her own exceptionalism. She was, in her own mind, the perfect judge, dispensing justice with unwavering precision and unwavering authority. Little did she know that this carefully constructed world was about to be shattered by a single, seemingly insignificant event. An event involving a royal guard and a very slight shuffle of his feet. The collision of Karen's inflated ego and the unyielding traditions of the crown was an accident waiting to happen. The morning of the incident began like any other in courtroom 3B, with an almost oppressive stillness. The air conditioning hummed softly, the only sound besides the rhythmic tapping of Karen's pen against her mahogany desk. Today's case was a relatively minor one, a dispute over a property line. But Karen approached it with the same gravity and attention to detail as she would a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. She expected absolute focus, absolute respect. Private Davies stood ramrod straight near the back of the courtroom, a splash of scarlet and gold amidst the somber suits. Of the lawyers and spectators, he was there as part of a small, almost unnoticed detail, providing a touch of royal presence to a civic event taking place later that day. He had been standing at attention for close to an hour, and the polished boots, while impeccably shined, were starting to feel like instruments of torture. At a slight shift, that was all. It was a barely perceptible adjustment of his weight, a quiet creak of leather as he subtly redistributed the pressure on his aching feet. To anyone else in the room, it would have been utterly insignificant, easily dismissed as background noise. But to Judge Karen Thompson, it was an act of brazen defiance. Perhaps she was already on edge. The humidity was higher than usual that day, wreaking havoc on her perfectly coiffed hair. Or maybe she had received a less than glowing review of her recent television appearance. Whatever the reason, Karen was primed for a confrontation. The creak seemed to reverberate through the silent courtroom, amplified. In Karen's mind, to the sound of a collapsing building, her head snapped up, her eyes narrowing as she fixed her gaze on the royal guard. "You!" she barked, her voice cutting through the stillness like a shard of ice. The lawyers in the front row flinched. Private Davies, accustomed to the strict protocols of royal service, remained impassive, but his eyes flickered with surprise. "Yes, you, in the ridiculous outfit," Karen continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "Do you have something to say? Or are you simply intent on disrupting the proceedings with your fidgeting?" A ripple of unease spread through the courtroom. People craned their necks to see what was happening. The bailiffs exchanged confused glances, and no one had ever dared to address a royal guard in such a manner, especially not in a setting like this. Private Davies stood his ground, his face a mask of polite indifference. He knew that any sudden movement, any show of emotion, would only escalate the situation. But inside, a flicker of annoyance began to ignite. He was a representative of the crown, and he was being publicly humiliated by an American judge? This was not going to end well. The air crackled with tension. Private Davies, maintaining his composure, replied in a measured tone. Your Honor, I apologize if I caused any disturbance. I am here as part of the royal delegation. Karen cut him off before he could finish. I don't care who you're with or what you're doing here. This is my courtroom, and I will not tolerate such blatant disrespect. Her voice rose with each word, echoing through the silent space. Explain yourself, soldier. Why were you fidgeting? Davies attempted to clarify. Your Honor, I was merely adjusting my position. I have been standing at attention for some time and— Enough! Karen slammed her gavel down with a resounding thud. The sound reverberated through the courtroom, silencing Davies and causing several spectators to jump. I have heard enough of your excuses. This court finds you in contempt. A collective gasp swept through the room. Contempt of court was a serious charge, one rarely leveled against someone in Davies's position. The lawyers exchanged horrified glances. The bailiffs looked at each other, unsure of how to proceed. Even Karen's clerk, usually unflappable, paled visibly. Bailiffs, Karen commanded, her voice sharp and unwavering. Remove this disruptive element from my courtroom immediately. The bailiffs hesitated. Removing a royal guard from a courtroom, on the order of a local judge, felt wrong. That it violated some deeply ingrained sense of protocol and respect for authority. But Karen's gaze brooked no argument. With a sigh of resignation, they approached Davies, their faces etched with discomfort. Sir, one of the bailiffs said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to come with us. Davies, his face still impassive, nodded slowly. He understood the situation. He was a soldier, trained to follow orders. He would not resist. But the look in his eyes suggested a simmering anger, a quiet fury at the injustice of it all. As the bailiffs escorted him towards the exit, an almost palpable silence descended upon the courtroom. The only sound was the soft rustle of their uniforms and the barely audible click of Davies's polished boots on the marble floor. Everyone present was stunned, frozen in disbelief. Judge Karen Thompson had just thrown a royal guard out of her courtroom, and everyone knew, with a sinking feeling in their stomachs, that she had made a terrible, terrible mistake. The consequences, they suspected, would be far-reaching and devastating. Throughout Karen's escalating tirade, Private Davies maintained an almost unnerving calm. While Karen's face flushed with anger and her voice dripped with scorn, Davies remained a picture of serene composure. His back was straight, his shoulders squared, and his gaze steady. He was a soldier, trained to withstand pressure, and he refused to let Karen's outburst break him. Even when she accused him of fidgeting and disrupting her courtroom, Davies responded with quiet dignity. He spoke in a clear, measured tone, attempting to explain his presence and the reason for his slight movement. He tried to convey the fact that he was not there as a private citizen, but as a representative of the crown on official duty. Your Honor, he said, his voice respectful but firm. I understand your concern for order, but I assure you, my actions were not intended as disrespectful. I am here as part of the advanced security detail for Her Majesty's visit later today. I represent the crown. He paused, expecting some acknowledgement, some sign of understanding. But Karen was unmoved. Her ego, inflated by recent successes and fueled by a deep-seated need for control, blinded her to reason. She saw Davies not as a representative of the crown, but as a personal affront, a challenge to her authority. I don't care if you represent the King of England himself, she retorted, her voice dripping with sarcasm. In my courtroom, everyone is subject to the same rules. And those rules dictate absolute silence and absolute obedience. Your royal affiliation is irrelevant. Her dismissal of his explanation was a slap in the face, not just to Davies personally, but to the very concept of royal authority. In that moment, Karen wasn't just challenging a royal guard. She was challenging the centuries-old traditions of the British monarchy. She was declaring her courtroom a sovereign territory, immune to the influence of kings and queens. Davies, though outwardly calm, felt a surge of anger that he had spent years training, serving his country with unwavering loyalty. He had faced down terrorists and protected dignitaries. And now he was being treated like a common criminal by an arrogant American judge who clearly had no understanding of protocol or respect for tradition. That he knew, with a growing sense of dread, that this incident was about to escalate far beyond the confines of courtroom 3B. The Queen would not take this lightly. The bailiffs, clearly uncomfortable with the task before them, approached Private Davies with hesitant steps. They were seasoned law enforcement officers, accustomed to dealing with unruly defendants and volatile situations, but this was different. This felt sacrilegious. "Sir," the lead bailiff mumbled, avoiding eye contact. "With all due respect, Judge Thompson has ordered us to escort you from the courtroom." Davies nodded, his expression unchanging. That he offered no resistance, no argument. He simply allowed the bailiffs to guide him towards the exit. The scene was almost comical in its absurdity. Two middle-aged men in ill-fitting uniforms gently ushering a stoic royal guard, resplendent in scarlet and gold, out of a courtroom. As they made their way down the aisle, a low murmur spread through the gallery. Some of the attendees, particularly those with connections to the local aristocracy, recognized Davies. Whispers of "That's Davies. Private Davies, he's the Queen's favorite," rippled through the room. The unease that had been simmering since Karen's initial outburst now boiled over into palpable anxiety. People began to fidget in their seats, exchanging worried glances. The lawyers, sensing a shift in the tectonic plates of power, started to subtly distance themselves from Karen. Even the bailiffs seemed to quicken their pace, eager to get Davies out of the courtroom and put an end to this bizarre spectacle. The lead bailiff, sweating profusely, kept glancing back at Karen, his face a mask of silent apology. As Davies reached the courtroom doors, he paused for a moment, turning to face Karen. His expression was unreadable, a perfect blend of military stoicism and quiet disdain. He offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that could have been interpreted as either respect or mockery. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out, the click of his boots echoing through the suddenly silent courtroom. The doors swung shut behind him, leaving Karen alone on her bench, the self-proclaimed queen of her little legal kingdom. But the kingdom was crumbling. The whispers continued, growing louder and more frantic. The lawyers shuffled their papers nervously. The bailiff stood awkwardly by the door, unsure of what to do next. Karen, oblivious to the storm brewing around her, straightened her robe and prepared to resume the proceedings. She cleared her throat, ready to reassert her authority. But the air had changed. The magic was gone. The courtroom no longer felt like her sanctuary. It felt like a trap. Despite the palpable tension and the unsettling whispers that filled the courtroom, Karen pressed on. She straightened her robe, adjusted her glasses, and cleared her throat, attempting to project an air of unwavering authority. Internally, however, a flicker of doubt had begun to surface. Had she overreacted? Perhaps. But she quickly squashed the thought. "Let's proceed," she announced, her voice regaining some of its earlier steel. "Mr. Henderson, you were about to present your evidence regarding the disputed property line. Please continue." As the lawyer nervously resumed his presentation, Karen retreated into her own mind, constructing a narrative that justified her actions. She told herself that she had acted decisively, protecting the integrity of the court from a disruptive influence. She had upheld the principles of order and respect, even in the face of royalty. She convinced herself that Davies's royal affiliation was irrelevant. In her courtroom, the law was the only sovereign, and she, Karen Thompson, was its faithful servant. She had simply done her duty, protecting the sanctity of the legal process from any and all threats, regardless of their origin. The whispers, she reasoned, were simply the result of ignorance and misplaced reverence for tradition. People didn't understand the importance of maintaining order in the courtroom. They didn't appreciate the delicate balance of justice. They were easily swayed by superficial symbols of power and prestige. But she, Karen Thompson, knew better. She was a judge, guardian of the law, and she would not be intimidated by fancy uniforms or royal titles. She had acted correctly, decisively, and she would stand by her decision. That a smug smile crept across her face as she listened to Mr. Henderson drone on about property lines and easements. She had restored order. She had reasserted her authority. She had proven, once again, that she was in control. The uneasiness in the courtroom, she attributed to the inherent drama of the legal process. People were simply on edge, anticipating the outcome of the case. They were impressed by her decisive action, even if they didn't fully understand it. She basked in what she perceived as a restoration of order, a triumph of law over chaos. She was Karen Thompson, the brilliant judge, the champion of justice, and she would not be deterred by the murmurs of the ignorant or the threats of the powerful. But even as she congratulated herself on her unwavering commitment to principle, a small, nagging voice in the back of her mind whispered a warning. You have made a mistake, a terrible mistake, and the consequences are about to be unleashed. The veneer of normalcy that Karen so desperately tried to maintain began to crack. Subtle signs, initially dismissed, started to accumulate, painting a clear picture of impending disaster. The whispers, which had initially been hushed and sporadic, grew louder and more persistent. They were no longer just whispers of recognition, but whispers of alarm, of disbelief, of outright fear. Karen's clerk, usually a bastion of efficiency and composure, began to fidget nervously. She received a series of increasingly frantic phone calls, each one more hushed and urgent than the last. She tried to shield the calls from Karen's attention, but the anxious tone of her voice and the worried expression on her face were impossible to ignore. The lawyers, too, were exhibiting strange behavior. They exchanged furtive glances, their faces etched with concern. They whispered among themselves, their voices barely audible above the drone of Mr. Henderson's presentation. Several of them discreetly checked their phones, their thumbs flying across the screens as they frantically searched for information. Mr. Henderson, normally a confident and articulate advocate, stumbled over his words, his voice trembling slightly. He kept losing his train of thought, repeatedly apologizing for his momentary lapses in concentration. It was clear that his mind was elsewhere, preoccupied with something far more significant than property lines and easements. Even the air in the courtroom seemed to thicken, becoming heavy with a sense of foreboding. The atmosphere of order and control that Karen had so carefully cultivated had completely dissipated, replaced by a palpable anxiety that hung in the air like a shroud. The bailiffs, still standing awkwardly by the door, seemed to grow increasingly agitated. They exchanged worried glances, their hands hovering nervously near their weapons. They were seasoned law enforcement officers, trained to handle all sorts of emergencies, but they had never encountered anything quite like this. The proceedings continued, but they were now a mere charade, a hollow performance played out against a backdrop of mounting dread. No one was truly listening to Mr. Henderson's presentation. Everyone was waiting, anticipating the inevitable explosion that was about to shatter Karen's carefully constructed world. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were almost a roar in Karen's ears. She could no longer ignore them. She could no longer pretend that everything was normal. Something was terribly wrong, and she, Karen Thompson, was at the center of it all. The pieces were about to fall. Karen, attempting to regain control of the deteriorating situation, interrupted Mr. Henderson mid-sentence. Mr. Henderson, she said, her voice strained but firm. I believe we've heard enough about the intricacies of property law for one morning. I'm prepared to render a decision. She paused, expecting a collective sigh of relief. Instead, she was met with stunned silence. The lawyers, the bailiffs, even Mr. Henderson himself, seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for something else before Karen could pronounce her judgment. Her clerk, Ms. Davies, no relation to the Royal Guard, much to Karen's later dismay, rushed towards the bench, her face pale and contorted with panic. She stumbled slightly, nearly tripping over her own feet, a clear indication of the level of distress she was experiencing. Your Honor, she gasped, her voice barely audible above the pounding of Karen's heart. I have something you need to see. Immediately, Karen frowned, annoyed by the interruption. Ms. Davies, I am about to deliver a ruling. Can't this wait? No, Your Honor, Ms. Davies insisted, her voice trembling. It really can't. It's about the Royal Guard. Karen's blood ran cold. She reluctantly accepted the note that Ms. Davies thrust into her hand. It was a brief, handwritten message, scrawled on a piece of official stationery. The words swam before her eyes, blurring together in a jumble of ink. She blinked, took a deep breath, and focused her attention on the message. It read, Judge Thompson, it has come to our attention that you have removed Private Alistair Davies from your courtroom. You should be aware that Private Davies is not just any royal guard. He is Her Majesty's personal favorite, handpicked for ceremonial duties and highly regarded within the royal household. His presence was specifically requested for today's events. This is a matter of grave concern. Please advise immediately. Lord Chamberlain's office. The words hit Karen like a physical blow. Her carefully constructed world crumbled around her. The smug smile vanished from her face, replaced by an expression of abject horror. She had not simply ejected a random royal guard from her courtroom. She had, in her arrogance and ignorance, insulted the Queen, disrupted her carefully planned schedule, and potentially triggered a diplomatic incident of epic proportions. The weight of her mistake crashed down on her, suffocating her, crushing her. She had made a terrible, terrible error, and there was no turning back. The backlash was coming. The color drained from Karen's face, leaving her complexion ashen and gaunt. Her hands, which had been so steady just moments before, now trembled uncontrollably. The note slipped from her grasp and fluttered to the floor. Unnoticed, her mind raced, desperately searching for a way out of this self-inflicted disaster. Could she pretend she hadn't seen the note? Could she claim it was a forgery? Could she somehow convince everyone that she had acted in the best interests of the crown, even if it meant temporarily inconveniencing its favorite guard? But deep down, she knew it was hopeless. The damage was done. The royal guard was gone. The Queen was undoubtedly furious, and the carefully constructed edifice of her career was about to come crashing down around her. She attempted to subtly backtrack, to somehow soften the blow of her earlier pronouncements. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Perhaps we should revisit the matter of the royal guard. That it seems there may have been a misunderstanding." The lawyers exchanged knowing glances. They knew exactly what was happening. They had witnessed Karen's hubris, her arrogance, her unwavering belief in her own infallibility, and now they were witnessing her downfall. "Your Honor." One of the lawyers, a particularly audacious young woman named Ms. Rodriguez, spoke up, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Are you suggesting that the rules of this court are flexible? That they apply differently to members of the royal family?" Karen flinched. Ms. Rodriguez's words were a direct challenge to her authority, a public acknowledgement of her hypocrisy. She tried to regain control, to reassert her dominance. "Of course not, Ms. Rodriguez," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The rules of this court apply to everyone. But in certain exceptional circumstances, it may be necessary to exercise discretion." Her attempt at damage control was pathetic, transparent. Everyone in the courtroom could see that she was panicking, desperately trying to salvage her reputation. But it was too late. The carefully crafted image of the brilliant, unwavering judge had been shattered. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. More emboldened people were no longer afraid to speak their minds. They had seen Karen's weakness, her vulnerability, and they were relishing the moment. Karen slumped back in her chair. Defeated, she knew that she had lost control of the situation. She knew that she had made a mistake that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She knew that the backlash was coming, and she knew that there was nothing she could do to stop it. The Queen was coming for her. The property line dispute, which had seemed so important just hours ago, now faded into insignificance. The trial, for all intents and purposes, had ground to a halt. No one was paying attention to the evidence, the arguments, or the legal precedents. All eyes were on Karen, waiting to see what she would do next. Karen, desperate to regain control, attempted to reassert her authority. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "please continue with your closing arguments." But Mr. Henderson, emboldened by Karen's obvious discomfiture, refused. "Your Honor," he said, his voice surprisingly firm, "with all due respect, I don't think anyone is in the right frame of mind to continue these proceedings at this time. Perhaps it would be best to adjourn until this matter has been resolved." Other lawyers chimed in, echoing Mr. Henderson's sentiments. They had been cowed by Karen's authority for years, afraid to challenge her rulings or question her judgment. But now, they sensed an opportunity. They had seen her weakness, her vulnerability, and they were ready to seize the moment. Ms. Rodriguez, the audacious young lawyer who had challenged Karen earlier, stood up and addressed the court. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with defiance, I move that we suspend these proceedings indefinitely, pending a formal investigation into the events that have transpired today. A chorus of seconded filled the courtroom. Karen's authority had completely evaporated. The lawyers, who had once trembled at her every word, were now openly defying her. They had tasted freedom, and they were not about to relinquish it. Karen, defeated and humiliated, slumped back in her chair. She knew that she had lost. She knew that her career was over. She knew that the Queen was coming for her. The courtroom, which had once been her sanctuary, her kingdom, had now become a hostile environment. The lawyers, who had once been her subjects, were now her enemies. The bailiffs, who had once been her protectors, now looked at her with pity and disdain. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. They were no longer just whispers of fear and disbelief. They were whispers of schadenfreude, of vindication, of outright glee. Karen closed her eyes, wishing she could disappear, wishing she could rewind time and undo the events of the day. But it was too late. The damage was done. The backlash was coming, and she was powerless to stop it. The gavel felt heavy and useless in her hand. The courtroom doors seemed miles away. She was trapped, with the courtroom in open revolt. Karen retreated to her chambers, the weight of her impending doom pressing down on her with suffocating force. Her first instinct was damage control. She needed to contain the situation, to minimize the fallout, to somehow convince the powers that be that she was not a rogue judge intent on undermining the monarchy. She grabbed her phone, her hands still trembling, and began dialing. Her first call was to Judge Reynolds, a senior colleague and a mentor who had guided her early career. Reynolds had always been a staunch supporter, a voice of reason and a source of invaluable advice. But when Reynolds answered the phone, his tone was cold and distant. "Karen," he said curtly, "I've heard about what happened. I can't talk right now and I'm in a meeting." And with that, he hung up. Karen stared at the phone in disbelief. Reynolds had never been so dismissive. Something was seriously wrong. She dialed another number, this time reaching out to her former law school professor, Professor Davies, again, no relation to the Royal Guard. But the irony was not lost on Karen. Davies had always been impressed by her intellect and her ambition. He had written glowing letters of recommendation for her, opening doors that would have otherwise remained closed. But Davies, too, was evasive. "Karen," he said, his voice strained, "I'm very busy at the moment. Perhaps we can talk later." And then, with a thinly veiled sigh, he added, "I'm afraid I can't offer you any assistance at this time. This is a very delicate situation." Karen's heart sank. Even her closest allies were abandoning her. She was alone, adrift in a sea of trouble with no lifeline in sight. She made several more calls, each one met with similar responses. Coldness, evasiveness, thinly veiled disdain. People who had once clamored for her attention now refused to return her calls. People who had once praised her brilliance now whispered behind her back. The realization dawned on Karen that she was in serious trouble. This was not just a minor misstep, temporary embarrassment. This was a career-ending catastrophe. She had crossed a line, violated a sacred taboo, and there was no coming back. She slumped back in her chair, defeated and despairing. The phone slipped from her grasp and clattered to the floor. The silence in her chambers was deafening, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. She was alone, isolated, and utterly terrified. The Queen's wrath was about to descend upon her, and she was completely unprepared. As Karen sat in her chambers, paralyzed by fear and regret, the story was exploding online. Someone in the courtroom, likely a lawyer with a penchant for social media, had tweeted a brief account of the incident, including a grainy photo of Private Davies being escorted out by the bailiffs. The tweet went viral within minutes. The hashtag Judge Karen was born, quickly followed by hashtag Royal Rumble and hashtag Davies deserves respect. The internet, always eager for a juicy scandal, latched onto the story with gleeful abandon. Within hours, the story had spread across the globe, fueled by sensational headlines and outraged commentary. News websites, blogs, and social media platforms were flooded with articles, videos, and memes ridiculing Karen and leonizing Private Davies. Public opinion was overwhelmingly against her. People condemned her arrogance, her disrespect, and her blatant abuse of power. They accused her of being out of touch, elitist, and completely oblivious to the real world. The memes were particularly brutal. Karen was depicted as everything from a tyrannical queen to a petulant child. Her face superimposed on images of historical villains and cartoon characters. Private Davies, on the other hand, was hailed as a hero, a symbol of British stoicism and royal dignity. He was photoshopped into scenes from famous movies and historical events, always standing tall and unyielding in the face of adversity. The online backlash was relentless, unforgiving, and utterly devastating. Karen's social media accounts were flooded with hate mail and death threats. Her Wikipedia page was vandalized with insults and accusations. Her personal information was leaked online, exposing her to further harassment and abuse. The story was tailor-made for the internet age, a perfect storm of celebrity, scandal, and royal intrigue. It was a David and Goliath story, with Karen cast as the arrogant giant and Davies as the humble underdog. And the internet, as always, was firmly on the side of David. The online outrage reached a fever pitch when a video surfaced of Karen's earlier television interview. In the video, she boasted about her meticulous attention to detail, her unwavering commitment to justice, and her unwavering belief in her own infallibility. The video, now viewed through the lens of the Davies incident, was instantly transformed from a celebration of her achievements into a damning indictment of her hubris. As Karen sat in her chambers, staring blankly at the wall, she could almost hear the roar of the online mob baying for her blood. She had become a pariah, a laughingstock, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the legal system, and there was no escape. The internet never forgets. In the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace, the Queen received news of the incident with characteristic stoicism. There was no outburst of rage, no dramatic display of anger. Instead, a profound disappointment settled over her, a quiet sadness that her carefully planned day had been disrupted by such a petty and avoidable conflict. She did not shout or curse. She did not demand immediate retribution. Instead, she summoned her Lord Chamberlain, a man of impeccable manners and unwavering loyalty, and spoke to him in a voice barely above a whisper. "It seems," she said, her eyes fixed on a distant portrait of Queen Victoria, "that a certain American judge has demonstrated a regrettable lack of understanding of proper protocol." She paused, allowing her words to hang in the air. "Private Davies is a valued member of my household," she continued, her voice hardening slightly. "He was chosen for today's duties precisely because of his discretion and his unwavering commitment to service." She turned to face the Lord Chamberlain, her gaze unwavering. "I trust," she said, her voice laced with subtle steel, "that this matter will be addressed with the utmost delicacy. I do not wish to create an international incident, but I cannot allow such blatant disrespect to go unpunished." The Lord Chamberlain bowed his head in acknowledgement. "Of course, Your Majesty," he said, his voice respectful. "I will see to it immediately." Later that day, a carefully worded statement was released by the palace, expressing the Queen's disappointment at the unfortunate incident involving Private Davies and Judge Thompson. The statement emphasized the importance of mutual respect and international cooperation, but it also hinted at the Queen's deep concern for the well-being of her loyal staff. The statement did not explicitly condemn Karen, but its subtle undertones were unmistakable. The Queen was displeased, and when the Queen was displeased, things tended to happen through an intermediary, a high-ranking member of the British Embassy. A message was conveyed to the American government. The Queen expects a formal apology, and she expects it soon. The message was delivered with the utmost politeness and discretion, but its meaning was clear. The Queen was not demanding retribution, but she was demanding satisfaction. She wanted Karen to acknowledge her mistake, to apologize for her disrespect, and to demonstrate a willingness to learn from her error. The Queen's reaction, though outwardly calm and measured, sent shockwaves through the American government. No one wanted to be on the receiving end of the Queen's displeasure, and everyone knew that Karen Thompson had made a powerful enemy. The gears were turning. The Queen's quiet displeasure unleashed a torrent of bureaucratic activity. The American government, eager to appease their powerful ally, launched a formal inquiry into Karen's conduct. The inquiry was swift, thorough, and utterly devastating. Karen was immediately placed on administrative leave, stripped of her judicial duties and barred from entering the courthouse. Her chambers were sealed, her staff reassigned. She was effectively erased from the legal landscape. The inquiry focused not only on the Davies incident but also on Karen's past rulings, her courtroom demeanor, and her overall fitness to serve as a judge. Her past cases were meticulously reviewed, her decisions scrutinized for any hint of bias or impropriety. The investigators interviewed lawyers who had appeared before her, court staff who had worked with her, and even litigants who had been affected by her rulings. The interviews painted a damning portrait of a judge who was arrogant, vindictive, and prone to abusing her power. Lawyers who had once feared Karen now spoke freely, recounting instances of her temper tantrums, her arbitrary rulings, and her blatant favoritism. Court staff members, emboldened by the investigation, revealed details of her obsessive-compulsive behavior, her demeaning treatment of subordinates, and her relentless pursuit of perfection. Even some of the litigants, those who had benefited from her rulings, expressed concerns about her fairness and her impartiality. They admitted that they had been intimidated by her, afraid to challenge her authority even when they believed she was wrong. The investigation uncovered a pattern of behavior that was deeply troubling. It revealed a judge who was more concerned with maintaining order and asserting her authority than with dispensing justice. It exposed a system that had allowed Karen to abuse her power for years, unchecked and unchallenged. The findings of the inquiry were leaked to the press, further fueling the online outrage and solidifying Karen's reputation as a villain. The hashtag Justice for Davies trended worldwide, accompanied by calls for Karen's impeachment and disbarment. The pressure on Karen was immense. She was vilified in the media, ostracized by her colleagues, and abandoned by her friends. She was alone, isolated, and utterly desperate. As the investigation closed in, Karen began to realize the full extent of her folly. She had allowed her ego to cloud her judgment, her ambition to corrupt her principles. She had become the very thing she had sworn to fight against. A tyrant. As the investigation intensified and the online outrage reached a fever pitch, Karen found herself increasingly isolated. Former allies and mentors, who had once sung her praises and showered her with accolades, now distanced themselves from her, eager to avoid being tainted by her scandal. Judge Reynolds, her former mentor, refused to return her calls. Professor Davies, her law school professor, sent her a brief, impersonal email expressing his deep regret at the unfortunate circumstances. Other judges, lawyers, and legal scholars, who had once sought her counsel and admired her intellect, now avoided her like the plague. Even her friends, those who had stood by her through thick and thin, began to waver. They stopped inviting her to social gatherings, avoided her calls, and subtly distanced themselves from her in public. They were embarrassed by her actions, afraid of being associated with her downfall. Karen's reputation, painstakingly built over years of hard work and dedication, crumbled before her eyes. The image of the brilliant, unwavering judge, which she had so carefully cultivated, was shattered beyond repair. She was now known as Judge Karen, the arrogant, out-of-touch jurist who had dared to disrespect the Queen. Her accomplishments, her accolades, her contributions to the legal community, all were forgotten. Overshadowed by the Davies incident, she was defined by her mistake, reduced to a caricature of her former self. The loss of support was devastating. Karen had always prided herself on her intelligence, her competence, and her unwavering commitment to justice. But now, she was forced to confront the reality that she had alienated everyone around her. She had become so obsessed with power and control that she had lost sight of the values that had once guided her. She had sacrificed her relationships, her reputation, and her career on the altar of her own ego, and now, she was paying the price. She was alone, isolated, and utterly bereft as she sat in her darkened apartment, scrolling through the endless stream of hateful comments and mocking memes. Karen realized that she had lost everything. She had lost her career, her friends, her reputation, and her self-respect. She had become a pariah, a laughingstock, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the legal system, and there was no way back. Under intense pressure from the government and her own legal team, Karen reluctantly agreed to issue a public apology. She hired a crisis management firm, which crafted a carefully worded statement designed to mitigate the damage and appease the Queen. The apology was delivered in a somber tone, with Karen standing stiffly before a bank of microphones, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She expressed her deep regret for the unfortunate incident involving Private Davies and acknowledged that her actions had caused offense to Her Majesty the Queen and the people of Great Britain. She insisted that she had acted in good faith, motivated only by a desire to maintain order and decorum in her courtroom. She claimed that she had not been aware of Private Davies's special status and that she would never intentionally disrespect the Crown. But the apology rang hollow. It was clear that Karen was simply going through the motions, reciting lines that had been written for her by someone else. There was no genuine contrition in her voice, no real acknowledgement of the harm she had caused. Her carefully worded statement was widely mocked and deemed insincere. Social media erupted with scorn and ridicule. The hashtag #SorryNotSorryKaren trended worldwide, accompanied by sarcastic memes and scathing commentary. People accused her of being disingenuous, self-serving, and completely out of touch with reality. They pointed out that she had never apologized to Private Davies directly and that she had failed to take responsibility for her own actions. The Queen, too, was unimpressed. The apology, which had been intended to appease her, only served to reinforce her negative impression of Karen. She saw it as a cynical attempt to manipulate public opinion, a further example of Karen's arrogance and self-importance. The apology, instead of mitigating the damage, further fueled the backlash. It convinced many people that Karen was incapable of remorse, that she was more concerned with saving her own skin than with acknowledging the harm she had caused. The crisis management firm, realizing that their efforts were backfiring, advised Karen to retreat from the public eye and let the storm blow over. But it was too late. The damage was done. The apology had failed, and the consequences were about to be unleashed. Karen had become a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when power and ego collide. While Karen's world was collapsing around her, Private Davies remained a picture of stoic dignity. He refused to be drawn into the media frenzy, declining all requests for interviews and issuing no public statements. He simply carried on with his duties, performing his role with unwavering professionalism and quiet grace. He understood that the incident was not about him personally, but about the importance of respecting tradition and upholding the dignity of the Crown. He was a soldier, trained to serve his country and protect its institutions, and he would not allow Karen's actions to undermine those values. His silence, however, spoke volumes. It conveyed a sense of quiet strength and unwavering resolve that resonated with people around the world. He became an unlikely folk hero, a symbol of British resilience and royal dignity. The memes that celebrated his stoicism and ridiculed Karen's arrogance only served to amplify his image as a champion of the underdog. He was depicted as a modern-day Sir Galahad, a knight in shining armor who had stood tall in the face of adversity. The Queen, deeply touched by Davies's unwavering loyalty and his dignified response to the incident, summoned him to Buckingham Palace for a private audience. She thanked him for his service and praised him for his exemplary conduct. While the details of their conversation remained confidential, it was widely rumored that the Queen had bestowed upon Davies a personal commendation, a rare honor reserved for those who had demonstrated exceptional courage and devotion to duty. Davies, ever humble, downplayed the significance of the commendation. He insisted that he was simply doing his job, serving his country to the best of his ability. But his colleagues knew that the Queen's recognition was a testament to his character and his unwavering commitment to excellence. In the aftermath of the incident, Davies's popularity soared. He received countless letters of support and admiration from people around the world. He was offered lucrative endorsement deals and showered with gifts and accolades. But Davies remained grounded, refusing to be swayed by the attention and adulation. He continued to perform his duties with the same quiet dignity and unwavering professionalism that had defined his career. He was a soldier, a servant of the Crown, and he would not allow anything to distract him from his mission. He understood the value of quiet service. While Karen's name became synonymous with arrogance and abuse of power, Davies's name became synonymous with humility, dignity, and unwavering loyalty. He had emerged from the incident as a true hero, a symbol of everything that was good and noble about the British monarchy. The professional consequences of Karen's actions were swift and severe. The formal inquiry concluded that she had engaged in conduct unbecoming a judge, abused her power, and demonstrated a lack of respect for the law and the institutions she was sworn to uphold. She was stripped of her judgeship, effectively ending her judicial career. The disbarment proceedings were equally swift and decisive. The Bar Association, citing the findings of the inquiry and the overwhelming evidence of her misconduct, voted to revoke her license to practice law. Karen was now a pariah, not only in the legal community but in society as a whole. She was ostracized by her colleagues, abandoned by her friends, and vilified in the media. Her reputation, once a source of pride and accomplishment, was now a mark of shame and disgrace. Her winning streak, which had defined her career, was definitively over. She had lost everything: her job, her reputation, her friends, and her self-respect. She was alone, isolated, and utterly defeated. The once imposing Judge Karen Thompson was now a shadow of her former self, a cautionary tale of what happens when ego and ambition collide. She had become a symbol of the abuse of power, a reminder that no one is above the law. Her carefully constructed world had crumbled around her, leaving her with nothing but regret and recrimination. She had sacrificed everything on the altar of her own ego, and now she was paying the price. She attempted to find work as a legal consultant, but no one would hire her. Her reputation was too toxic, her name too closely associated with scandal and disgrace. She was unemployable, a leper in the legal community. She was forced to sell her apartment, her car, and her other possessions to pay her legal bills. She moved into a small, cramped apartment in a rundown neighborhood, far from the gilded halls of the courthouse and the lavish parties of the legal elite. She spent her days holed up in her apartment, avoiding the outside world, haunted by the memories of her past glories and the shame of her present circumstances. She was a broken woman, stripped of her power, her prestige, and her purpose. Karen Thompson was truly finished. In the solitude of her cramped apartment, Karen was forced to confront the wreckage of her life. The silence was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the occasional siren wailing in the distance. She had plenty of time to reflect, to examine her actions, and to consider the choices that had led her to this point. Did she learn from her mistakes? Did she recognize the hubris that had led to her downfall? Or did she remain convinced of her own righteousness, blaming everyone else for her predicament? The answer, perhaps unsurprisingly, was complex. There were moments of genuine remorse, moments when she acknowledged the arrogance and the self-importance that had blinded her to the consequences of her actions. She recognized that she had become obsessed with power and control, that she had lost sight of the values that had once guided her. She replayed the Davies incident in her mind countless times. Agonizing over the choices she had made, she wondered if she could have handled the situation differently, if she could have avoided the catastrophic chain of events that had followed. But those moments of self-awareness were fleeting, often overshadowed by feelings of resentment and self-pity. She blamed the media for sensationalizing the story, the lawyers for betraying her, and the Queen for being unforgiving. She convinced herself that she had been unfairly targeted, that she had been made a scapegoat for the sins of the legal system. She clung to the belief that she had acted in good faith, that she had only been trying to uphold the law and maintain order in her courtroom. She refused to acknowledge the full extent of her own culpability, clinging to the remnants of her former self-image. She was still Karen Thompson, the brilliant judge, the champion of justice. She had simply been misunderstood, unfairly maligned. In the end, Karen remained trapped between these conflicting narratives. She was aware of her flaws, but she was unwilling to fully confront them. She recognized her mistakes, but she refused to take complete responsibility for her actions. She was a broken woman, haunted by the ghosts of her past, unable to find peace or redemption. Whether she truly learned from her mistakes remained an open question, a matter of speculation and debate. Perhaps, in the depths of her solitude, she found some measure of self-awareness. But if she did, it was not enough to save her. The damage was done. The downfall was complete. And Karen Thompson was left to grapple with the consequences of her actions, alone in the darkness. The Davies-Thompson affair, as it came to be known, left a lasting impact on the legal system and on the relationship between the United States and Great Britain. It served as a stark reminder of the importance of humility, respect, and the need for accountability, even for those in positions of power. Judges across the country were reminded of the importance of maintaining impartiality and avoiding even the appearance of bias. Law schools added new courses on judicial ethics and the dangers of unchecked ego. The legal system, shaken by the scandal, vowed to implement stricter oversight mechanisms to prevent similar abuses of power in the future. Private Davies, meanwhile, continued his service with unwavering dedication. He remained a valued member of the Queen's household, forever remembered as the royal guard who had faced down a judge and emerged victorious. He became a symbol of British resilience and royal dignity, his image adorning posters, T-shirts, and even commemorative coins. He was invited to speak at schools and community events, sharing his story of quiet courage and unwavering loyalty. The Queen, deeply grateful for his service and touched by his humility, continued to bestow upon him special honors and privileges. He was granted access to exclusive events, invited to dine at Buckingham Palace, and given a lifetime pass to all royal residences. In the aftermath of the incident, the British government subtly introduced a new law clarifying the rights of royal guards on duty. The law, known as the Davies Accords, affirmed the right of royal guards to perform their duties without interference and protected them from harassment and abuse. The Davies Accords served as a lasting tribute to Private Davies and a reminder of the importance of respecting the traditions and institutions of the British monarchy. The law ensured that no royal guard would ever again be subjected to the kind of treatment that Davies had endured. The Davies-Thompson affair faded from the headlines over time, but its legacy endured. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most powerful individuals are subject to the rule of law and that arrogance and disrespect will always be punished. And so, Karen Thompson faded into obscurity, a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of law schools and legal conferences. Private Alastair Davies, on the other hand, remained a symbol of unwavering duty and quiet dignity, forever etched in the annals of British history. The end.